Welcome to Stanford Legal, where we look at the cases, questions, conflicts, and legal stories that affect us all every day. I'm Pam Karlan, along with Joe Bankman.
Hi, Pam.
Hey, Joe.
Pam, our guest today is Stanford Professor Jon Krosnick. Hello, John.
Hi.
John's going to talk to us about what voters want in a politician. But before getting to that, I want to bring up something more general. Law often has a lot to do with politics and vice versa. And Pam, this week you argued a Supreme Court case on the intersection of law and politics. Can you tell us about that a little bit?
Sure. So I was representing a man named Fane Lozman who went to protest at his city council meeting about corruption in the city, and within about 15 seconds of his getting up to begin his remarks during the public comment section, he was arrested and dragged away in handcuffs. And he brought a lawsuit pointing out that the members of the city council had had a meeting months before to talk about how angry they were at his being a gadfly in the city council. And so the question is really whether the First Amendment, which protects your right to petition, which means to bring lawsuits, and to complain about the government, whether the First Amendment allows you to bring a lawsuit for an arrest, even if maybe they had some probable cause for the arrest. So it was a really interesting case to take to the court.
So the city council thought this is a really annoying guy, like I might find a student annoying, but instead of giving the student a dirty look, they had him thrown in jail.
Yeah, they had him thrown in jail, and ultimately they never charged him with anything. But still, he
spent a couple nights in jail?
No, he was just there. He was just there for a couple of hours. But he brought a lawsuit about it, and the question is, can you bring a lawsuit even if there's what's called probable cause for the underlying arrest, which is maybe he was interrupting the city council?
And, Pam, we've talked about arguing before the Supreme Court before. We had a show, and this is your eighth argument, which is a big number for those of you out there for a lawyer. The average lawyer has .0000 arguments before that court. Were there any highlights you could share with us?
So one of the highlights was, of course, when you hear a justice making arguments that you've made to the other side and saying, well, what about this? That's always a highlight. And the moment that I loved the best in the argument was, the justices ask you hypotheticals. Well, what if this happened? Then what would your rule be? And after I had finished the first part of my argument and sat down, the lawyer for the other side was up, and Justice Kagan said to him, Ms. Karlan was having some problems with some hypotheticals, but I think you have some problems with the actual facts of the case. And that was a great moment. And if you read the transcript, you'll see on the transcript it says laughter after that. And if you listen, you'll hear the laughter.
Did you feel like high-fiving your co-counsel when that comment came out?
Well, you have to maintain a poker face in the court. So I just sat there and smiled. But inside I was high-fiving.
Well, this was a big week for Stanford Law School, not only in getting yet another argument before the Supreme Court. I should note that we had one a month or so ago by
and we had another one the week
Fisher.
before as well. So we had two of the cases that were argued in the February sitting were argued by Stanford faculty, and one case was actually argued by an alumnus of our clinic, a woman who's now in the Solicitor General's office. So it was a good week for Stanford.
An exciting week for the Supreme Court clinic, and another colleague of ours, Nate Persily, redrew at the request of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court the congressional boundaries for that state.
We talked on an earlier show about political gerrymanders and the issue that's up at the Supreme Court now. This was a case that was brought in state court, though, challenging the way that Pennsylvania had drawn its congressional districts. As you probably know, Pennsylvania is really a kind of purple state. It's always a toss-up in the national elections. The Republicans had drawn the districts, and they'd drawn them in a way that was tremendously advantageous to the Republican Party. I think they got 13 of the 18 districts. And somebody brought a lawsuit, and the Pennsylvania Supreme Court struck down the districts, not on the grounds that they violated the U.S. Constitution, but on the grounds that they violated the Pennsylvania Constitution. And then they hired our colleague, Nate Persily, who's done this before as a special master, to be their consultant in redrawing the districts. And they chose one of the plans that he drew this week. And there's obviously, it's been a huge issue in Pennsylvania. And to talk about law and politics, the Republicans in the state Senate, I think, are talking about impeaching the justices of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court over the plan. They're going to go and try and get the U.S. Supreme Court to do something about it. But Nate is a real expert on drawing plans. He's done it in several states before. And so just a really interesting issue.
And that requires more than being, say, really good with pen and paper.
Yeah. Now you use a lot of computer technology to draw the districts. In the old days, they drew them with pencils and papers. There's a famous story about Robert Bork before he became a famous failed nominee for the Supreme Court. He was hired to draw the districts in Pennsylvania, and in Connecticut, and he went into a room with just a protractor and a ruler and drew the districts. This was in the 1970s, and as probably most of our listeners know, he was a very conservative Republican, but he drew the districts without looking at any political data. And he tells the story in his book of how he was sitting in the lunchroom at the state capitol, and John Bailey, who was the Democratic boss of Connecticut, came up to him and said, "I couldn't have drawn better districts myself." So, drawing districts is a really interesting thing. And our guest today, Jon Krosnick, has recently completed a massive study of what people in the United States think their representatives in Congress should be doing. I mean, once they get there. And so, Jon, I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about the survey you did and what the results were that surprised you the most.
Oh, I'm happy to. This project actually started with an interest in trying to understand why American approval of Congress is at a historic low at the moment and has been for years now. That hasn't moved, and it's been the case for a while. And there are three plausible explanations for why this might be true. One is that people are unhappy with gridlock, that for a long time Congress has had trouble passing any laws. Second possibility is that folks are unhappy with the products that Congress has produced, Obamacare being just one. Perhaps there's lots of objections to that. We wanted to put on the table a third possibility, what we call process disapproval. The idea that people are not unhappy with the volume of output or the quality of the output, but rather they're unhappy with the process. And it comes really importantly from the work of Tom Tyler, a political psychologist at NYU, who has done studies, for example, looking at judgments that people make about the fairness of legal proceedings. For example, imagine you go to court to fight a traffic ticket and you walk out afterwards and somebody who's a researcher asks you how fair was the procedure. The fairness and judgment of the procedure, you might think, comes from whether you won or lost. That, if you had to pay the ticket, then it was unfair, and if you didn't, then it was fair. But that's actually not how people think. They think about the process. Were they able to articulate their point of view? Was the judgment justified by the evidence before the court? And so that same logic, we thought, might apply to the Congress. And so maybe it's not only a story about the output, but rather the process of decision-making, and maybe people are unhappy. And in fact, that's what we found.
Well, this is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking with Jon Krosnick about his work on people's view of the process by which Congress members make their decisions. And what did you find about people's view of the process?
Well, we gave a representative national sample of American adults the opportunity to tell us how much attention they thought members of Congress should pay to 21 different criteria when they're deciding how to vote on a bill, and then to tell us how much attention they thought members of Congress actually pay to each of those 21 criteria.
And what were the biggest gaps that you found?
Well, the gaps were huge. What we found is that what the public wants is for representatives to pay attention to their constituents and to the country as a whole. So one view of democracy is that if I'm elected in the 3rd District of Michigan, I should be doing what the 3rd District tells me. But our respondents said, yeah, that's important. They say it's extremely important, but it's also important to pay attention to what's in the best interest of the residents of the 3rd District, even if they don't agree with you about that judgment, but also to pay attention to what is in the best interest of the nation as a whole and what the nation as a whole wants. That's the number one criteria.
That really struck me as, when I saw those numbers in the report, I was really struck by that because I'd always assumed, and I think most people had assumed, that the purpose of having districts was to recognize that there's a real diversity of public opinion in the United States, that people who live in rural areas have different views than urban, people who live on the coasts are different than people who live inland. And this suggests, when people say that they want you to pay attention both to the public opinion within the district and to the national public opinion? Is it because they think those two things are the same, or because they recognize that those two things may be dramatically different?
I'll explain it this way. I think if you think about the country operating ideally, and I'm sent to Congress to represent the 3rd District of Michigan, of course it's my responsibility to think about and look out for the interests and will of that district. But on the other hand, it is a democracy. And the idea that I might pay attention to what the country wants, I might say, well, yes, the people in my district want X, but the vast majority of the country doesn't want X. And I care about the rest of the country being represented in the process, not only by the voting, but also even by my own decision making.
Jon, what did they not want? They want their politicians to pay attention to them and maybe the country as a whole. What do they not want and think they're getting?
There are really 3 criteria that people would like to see much less of influencing voting in Congress. One is economic elite influence, the influence of donors and wealthy individuals and businesses. Secondly, supporters. So there is an argument you could make that, look, if somebody decides not to vote or to vote for somebody other than me, why should I be paying attention to them? But this is not, in fact, what the public would like to have happening. And lastly, as we know, people in Congress these days are very easy to predict in their voting behavior, simply knowing what their party affiliation is. Party leaders tell people how to vote, and they do it. And unfortunately, the public is quite unhappy about that.
But I thought there's also a lot of evidence that people have become much more partisan over time as well. So it seems like there's almost a kind of cognitive dissonance in people. They've become more partisan, and yet they don't want Congress to become more partisan. They presumably vote for somebody because they prefer that person's views to his or her opponent's views, and yet they think that once the person's elected, they shouldn't be paying attention to who got them into office. I mean, what accounts for this?
So let me pick apart. You said a lot of things at once.
Yeah.
So first of all, and it's my belief that people have not become more partisan in the way that you might think. So the number of Republicans and Democrats put together is about 50% of the country. That's been the case for a while. Independents actually have grown over the last 15 years.
Right, but I thought when people actually look at voting behavior, they say it's more predictable than ever whether somebody's going to vote for the Democratic candidates or the Republicans. That is, lots of people register as independents, but it turns out they always support the Republican candidate or they always support the Democratic candidate. So they like to think of themselves. I mean, a lot of this seems to be about people's image of themselves and image of Congress being quite dissonant with what their revealed preferences, what their actual behavior.
Yep. Okay.
Yes.
Let's go slowly again.
Yeah.
In many states, you can't register as anything. There is no party affiliation as a part of the registration. So let's set aside registration. Yeah. Instead, we'll talk about how people think of themselves. So our typical survey question might be, in general, do you think of yourself as a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent? There is no sense in which the number of partisans, either independents who pretend to be independent but are really leaners, no sense in which those individuals have become more partisan over time, or that partisans have become extreme. The one thing that has happened is the Republicans hate the Democrats more and the Democrats hate the Republicans more. But that doesn't interfere quite with the story that we're talking about.
So this is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking with Jon Krosnick about his work on what voters want in Congress.
Jon, you just said that things haven't really changed that much in terms of partisan behavior of the public in general. How about in terms of how much they like their particular representative and how much they like Congress in general or politicians in general? Has that held constant or has that changed?
Well, there has been this important decline in public approval of Congress, and there has also been a decline in public approval of their own representatives, but it's always been true in the history of polling that people like their own representative a bit more than they like Congress as a whole. So this ship rises and falls for everybody.
So it's a little bit like people decrying the sad state of public schools, but saying their kid's school is pretty good. Another result I think we find.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that people's views have been declining of Congress, but they've also, I think this takes us back to Nate Pursley, our colleague, who says that the polling data suggests that people's confidence in virtually every institution has gone down in recent years. So their confidence in the courts has gone down, their confidence in the presidency, in Congress, in the media, in corporations, in religion generally. What do you think is going on?
Well, there's, actually, before we lose this, there's one key finding we haven't talked about in this paper that touches on what you just raised, which is there's one area in which Americans feel that they are getting what they want. And that is only a small proportion of Americans want careful attention to be paid to the president when decision-making happens, and only a small proportion believe that the president is having substantial
You mean on
impact.
congressional
On Congress.
decision-making?
That's right. Now, this was true when we did our survey in the Obama administration years, and it's true when we've done it with President Trump as well. So that seems to transcend. And another key finding that I think is important to bear in mind here is that, we can find disagreement between Republicans and Democrats on just about everything in politics these days, except this survey. In this survey, Republicans and Democrats agree with each other both in what they want from Congress in terms of decision-making process and in terms of what they think they're getting.
That's fascinating, John. Did you look at other demographic characteristics? Do the wealthy believe with the poor, the urban and rural, and so on?
We did. And you can imagine in a very simple way that maybe wealthy people want Congress to pay more attention to wealthy people. And we saw a tiny bit of that difference, but absolutely no large difference at all. And that's also, I think, importantly in keeping with the fact that you could imagine in a cynical way that under the Obama administration, Democratic citizens would say, yeah, pay a lot of attention to the president. And then the minute the president becomes a Republican, those Democrats say, no, don't do that. But in fact, we see very comparable results over those 2 years to suggest that this is not a story of people saying, pay attention to me and do what I want. They're actually describing a procedure for decision-making that they stand behind no matter who's acting.
John, I want to now start probing you, a little bit about that procedure. Suppose I look at this and I say what people want is for you to pay attention to us. I'm naturally thinking of polls. But of course, there are a million polls out there, and doesn't it depend how things are framed? So talk to us a little bit about what we could do with this result.
Absolutely. So we haven't yet talked about a second group of people. Let me put them on the table before I answer your question. And this is what we in political science call the issue public. So for each issue, there is the general public and its preferences. And then there's the small set of people, maybe 10, 15, 20% at most on any particular issue, who have very strong feelings. So are the people who are very strongly pro-gun control and the people who are very anti-gun control, people who have very strong feelings about environmental protection, and so on. Each issue attracts passion from a group of people like that. And our survey indicated that Americans want elected representatives to pay attention both to the general public and to the issue public. And the good news is on the issue public, that's easy for representatives because those folks are writing letters and making phone calls and going to protests and giving contributions to lobbying groups. So the issue public's preferences get through to the elected representatives.
We'll be back with more from our guest, Jon Krosnick, about how Congress should be making its decisions next on Stanford Legal on Sirius XM Insight 121.